She did not hear us coming, which was the first thing I noticed about her. Most people on the border roads heard Vorith wolves before they saw us. They came to doorways, or they moved away from them. Senna did neither. She was already crouched in the snow beside Reth before I had dismounted, her hands moving along his flank with the flat, efficient certainty of someone who had done this 10,000 times and expected nothing from it. "Can you walk?" she said. She was talking to the wolf. Reth, who had not let anyone but me touch him in 11 years, put his great gray head down on her knee. I stayed in the trees. That was not cowardice. I had a reason for it, or I told myself I did. I was traveling the border roads without rank or guard, the way my father had once traveled them and the way I had not in years. The Greywood crossing between Vorith and Caldron territory had been contested for 3 winters, and I had wanted to see it as an ordinary man would see it, not as a king flanked by a retinue that made honest people close their mouths. Reth's injury, a steel trap snapped to the right forepaw, poorly concealed under the snow at a Mossgate crossing, had been a misfortune. The woman kneeling in the snow with him was something else. She worked without tools at first, just hands, running them along the leg, pressing here and there, reading whatever it is healers read in an animal that cannot tell them where it hurts. Then she spoke to him in a low, matter-of-fact voice, not the coaxing sing-song most people used with wolves they were frightened of, just plain address, the kind you'd give a neighbor you respected. "It's the joint, not the bone. That's good. Come inside if you'll come, and I'll wrap it and you'll be moving again in a week." Reth came inside. I stood in the trees until the lamp in her window steadied, which meant she had got him settled and was working. Then I went to the door. She opened it before I knocked. "I wondered when you'd come out of the forest," she said. She looked at me the way she had looked at Reth, thorough, unhurried, reading what she could find. "He's yours, isn't he?" It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "He's going to be fine. The trap caught the joint, but it's a clean injury. A week of wrapping and rest and he'll carry full weight." She held the door open. "You can sleep by the fire if you need to. The floor is hard, but it's warm." I did not tell her who I was. I don't know what I would have said if she'd asked, but she didn't ask. She asked whether I'd eaten, and when I said no, she put a bowl of something in my hands that was mostly root vegetables and warmth. She asked whether my boots had held up in the snow, because the Mossgate crossing had been throwing melt ice since the thaw, and she didn't trust it. She asked whether the steel traps at the crossing had been reported, because she'd treated 2 wolves and a deer in the last month from the same stretch of ground, and someone should be making noise about it. She did not ask whose pack I ran with. She did not ask which side of the Greywood I called home. She did not ask anything a border resident with any political sense would have asked first. I sat by her fire and watched her rewrap Reth's leg, and I felt something behind my sternum that said, "There. That one. You already know her, you just haven't lived the part of your life where you know yet." I did not acknowledge it. I had long experience in not acknowledging things. Her name was Senna. She told me that much, and she told me the rest of it without being asked. Not because she was the kind of woman who talked to fill quiet, but because she had learned that border travelers had a right to know whose house they were sleeping in case the allegiances mattered to them. "They usually don't matter to me," she said, stoking the fire, "in case you were wondering." "I wasn't," I said. That seemed to please her, in the quiet way things pleased her, a small settling in the shoulders, nothing more. She was the daughter of a Caldron woman and a Vorith man. Both packs had known it, and both had decided it was easier to let her go between them than to claim her, which meant she had grown up belonging to the roads between the territories rather than to either of them. She healed on the Vorith side when the Vorith needed her, and she healed on the Caldron side when the Caldron needed her, and nobody paid her much in either direction except in kind, firewood, grain, the occasional joint of meat in winter. "The Mossgate house isn't mine," she said. "It belongs to the crossing keeper, who is dead. I've been maintaining it for 3 winters in exchange for being able to use it. And before that, I moved, she said, a lot. She said it the way someone says a thing that has stopped hurting because they have stopped expecting it to change. I stayed 4 days. Reth would not leave, and that was the explanation I gave myself. On the 2nd day, she let me help her carry wood in from the stack behind the house, and I told her that the traps at Mossgate had been there since autumn, and that the warden responsible for them had been reported twice. On the 3rd day, she told me that the warden worked for a Caldron landman who had been grazing his animals on contested Greywood ground for 2 seasons, and that if the Alpha King of Voreth ever came through these roads, as she understood he occasionally did incognito, he might want to look into it. She said it completely without irony. She looked straight at me when she said it, and her expression was unchanged, and I understood that she was neither certain nor uncertain. She had simply decided that if the possibility was true, she would use it, because the traps were hurting wolves and someone needed to hear about it who could act. I looked at the fire. "I'll pass it along," I said. "Thank you," she said. On the 4th day, Reth could put weight on the leg, and I had no further reason to stay that I could explain aloud. I saddled my horse in the early morning while Senna repacked her healer's kit at the table without ceremony. "The wrapping needs to come off in 6 days, she said, not looking up. "The joint will be sound in 10. Keep him off the hard pack until then." "I will." The Mossgate traps, whoever sets policy on that side of the Greywood should know there are 3 more on the eastern branch. I haven't had time to map them all. I'll make sure they know. She walked to the door with me. The morning was very cold, a gray February cold with no wind to it, just wait. Reth walked ahead of us and stood by the horse with his tail moving, not wagging exactly, just stating a quiet opinion. Senna looked at him, then at me. "He doesn't want to go," she said. "No," I said, "he doesn't." She handed me a small wrapped packet. "Willow bark compress. For the joint if it stiffens in the cold. Steep it in hot water and apply it warm, not scalding." I took it. Our hands did not quite touch, but they were close enough that I felt the warmth of her fingers, and something in my right wrist pulled tight, a feeling like a cord plucked on a string I had not known was there. I did not look down at my wrist. I put the packet in my coat. "Thank you," I said, "for him and for the fire." "Anyone would have done it," she said. But that was not true. I had been riding the border roads for 4 days, and no one else had. I went back to Voreth and did several things. I pulled the warden responsible for the Mossgate traps and assigned that stretch of crossing to a man who understood what the Greywood neutral ground was supposed to be. I sent a surveying party to map the eastern branch Senna had mentioned. I had 3 meetings about the contested grazing land. None of this was unusual. It was the ordinary business of governing a border territory, the kind of thing that accumulated when a king stayed in his hall too long without walking his own roads. But I also thought about a woman who tended wolves without asking whose they were. I thought about this with more frequency than I could justify, which was unlike me. I was a man of decisions. I made them, I executed them. I moved to the next one. I did not linger over a bowl of root vegetables by a borrowed fire in a house that wasn't anyone's, or over the particular quality of a person who addressed a wounded animal the way you'd address a neighbor. In March, I had cause to ride the Mossgate Road again. Official cause, genuine cause, there was a patrol dispute I needed to see firsthand. I went with 2 guards and no fanfare. The dispute was at the crossing. The Mossgate house was a half-mile south. I spent 2 hours at the crossing. Then I went south. She was in the yard when I arrived, and she looked up without surprise. "The King of Voreth," she said, "in person this time." "You knew in February." "I suspected in February." She wiped her hands on her apron. You fight with your hands like you were trained for it. And Reth, he's not a wolf anyone would have, except someone who was given the best. That's reasoning. It's what I had. She showed me in. She made tea. She was the same as she had been, unhurried, practical, looking at me the way she looked at everything, like a problem that was interesting and not frightening. Reth went directly to the hearthside, memory having no patience for ceremony. I told her the patrol dispute had been settled. I told her the Eastern Branch traps had all been removed and logged. She nodded, taking this in, and said that there had been fewer injuries in the last month than she had noticed. You keep track, I said. I keep track of what comes through the door, she said. It adds up to something over time. I drank my tea. I looked at the window, which showed the Greywood bare and brown and patient at this edge of spring. I wanted to say something I did not know how to say, which was that I had thought about her with unreasonable frequency for 6 weeks, and that Reth had walked to the gate every morning and looked south, and that I had a feeling in my right wrist I did not want to explain to my physician. I said none of it. I said the Mossgate house, the crossing keeper's agreement, it was verbal. It was. If it were formalized, the house would be yours, and the maintenance arrangement would come with a small stipend from the Vorth Border Fund. You'd be a registered healer at the Mossgate crossing. You'd have ground. She was quiet for a long moment. That would put me on the Vorth side of the ledger, she said. It would put you on the Mossgate crossing ledger, which is its own category. She looked at me steadily. You're not just settling an administrative loose end. No, I said, I'm not. She looked at her hands. Give me a month to think about it. Take 2, I said. She took 3 weeks. The letter she sent was in the small, efficient handwriting I had expected. I'll take the arrangement on one condition. It's clear in the document that the posting is professional, not political, and that I serve both sides of the Greywood under it. I'm not interested in being a Vorth instrument on a contested road. I had the document drawn up accordingly, and I signed it, and I added a line at the bottom. The posting is professional. The road will be served. The other matter, if there is one, is separate and not a condition of either of us. She wrote back, agreed. The other matter, if there is one, will have to figure itself out. I did not know whether to find this discouraging. My counselor Draveth, who was old enough to have watched my father court my mother, and had therefore seen what a Vorth alpha looked like when he was trying to be patient, found it extremely entertaining and said so at length. She's smarter than you, Draveth said. I know, I said. And she won't be hurried. I know. Good, he went back to his maps. You've been hurrying everything since you were 17. It's time something made you stop. I rode the Mossgate Road 6 more times between spring and late summer. Not always with excuse. Sometimes the excuse was thin, and I knew it, and Senna probably knew it, and we both said nothing about it. She was establishing her practice at the crossing, which meant she was busier than before. She had begun keeping a log of the injuries she treated and the causes she suspected, and she was sending copies of the relevant sections to the border wardens on both sides. On the Caldron side, this had been received with a mixture of respect and suspicion. On the Vorth side, the wardens had started addressing her by name. I watched her build this, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, the same way she did everything. And I thought about what it cost a person to be steady for decades in a life that kept providing no ground to stand on, and I thought that if I had any courage I would say so. On a warm September evening I did say so, or a version of it. We were sitting outside the Mossgate house with the last of the light going amber over the Greywood, and she was reading a section of her log aloud, a stretch about the Mossgate crossing in high summer, the pattern she'd noticed, and she stopped and looked up, and I was looking at her instead of at the Greywood. What is it? She said. I have thought about you, I said, every day since February. She set the log down. And Reth, I said, because I was making a terrible job of this, walks to the southern gate every morning. She looked at him. He was lying in the grass at her feet and making no apologies for it. Aldrich, she said. It was the first time she had used my name without the title, and it did something to the evening air. I know you didn't take the posting for this reason, I said, and I'm not asking you to give me an answer tonight. I'm asking whether there's a conversation to be had. She was quiet for a long time. The graywood went dark at the edges. There might be, she said. I'll have to think about it. Take your time, I said. That seems to be the arrangement, she said, and she said it with the smallest pull of something at the corner of her mouth that I had been thinking about for 7 months. The Caldron Moot in October was not something I had planned to attend. The Moot was a seasonal border assembly, representatives of both packs, a neutral hall, formal business about grazing lines and road maintenance, and the winter hunting schedule. I had sent Draveth to the last 4. I went to this one because I had a specific piece of territory business that required the Alpha's seal, and because the Mossgate posting was on the agenda, and because if anyone was going to present the work Senna had done on the border injury logs, it should be done with the weight of someone who understood what it represented. Senna did not know I was coming. I arrived the evening before the Moot and was put up at the Caldron Hall, and I sent no word. The Moot Hall was a long stone building, old, neutral-scented in the way old neutral ground smells, like belonging to no one and everyone equally. Senna arrived with the other Mossgate representatives. She saw me across the hall and went very still for a moment, then crossed to me. "You didn't tell me you were coming," she said. "I decided late," I said. "The Mossgate posting is on the agenda." "I know," she studied my face. "You're here for that." "Partly," I said. She looked at me for another moment, then went to take her seat. The morning went through ordinary business, grazing lines, road maintenance obligations, the winter hunt schedule. The Mossgate posting was 6th on the agenda, presented by the Voreth Border Secretary, who read the terms in a clear voice. A professional posting, non-political, serving both sides of the Graywood under a registered healer, with documentation of service to date. Then an elder from the Caldron delegation, a man named Bracht, gray-haired and formally dressed, who had attended these moots for 30 years, raised his hand. "We have a question about the healer's standing," Bracht said. "The Mossgate posting gives her a Voreth address. We want it on the record that her Caldron service is not therefore subordinated." The secretary was about to respond with the document's language, but Bracht was not finished. "We've heard this woman called the Border Girl," Bracht said, "rootless. Claimed by neither pack. If the Voreth posting formalizes her status, we want to know whether the Caldron pack is losing ground on that road." He said it without malice. It was a political question, the kind that had been asked at these moots for 30 years, but rootless sat in the hall like a word that was used to it. I stood up. I had not intended to stand up at that moment. The motion was not planned, or perhaps it was, somewhere below the level at which I planned things, in whatever part of me had been paying attention since February. "Healer Senna," I said, "is not rootless." The hall was quiet. Bracht looked at me with the careful patience of a man who had been watching Alpha Kings say things at moots for a long time. "She has treated Caldron wolves and Voreth wolves without distinction," I said, "and she has documented the border injuries on this road for 2 years in a way that has allowed both packs to address the causes. The Mossgate posting does not claim her for Voreth. It gives her ground, which is something this hall and mine have both failed to do for her for 20 years. Bracht said nothing. "She is the healer of the Mossgate crossing," I said. "She belongs to the road that belongs to both packs, and if there is any question of her standing before this moot, I will answer it personally." I reached across the distance between my chair and hers. She was 2 seats away, which in the narrow stone hall was not far, and I took her hand. The mark burned. It was not a gradual thing. It was simultaneous. I felt it on my right wrist as she pulled in a sharp breath and looked down at hers. The same instant, the same wrist, the same flare of heat that went and left a warmth that did not fade. I looked at my wrist. She looked at hers. The mark was there on both of us, the Voreth bond sign in its old form, the one my grandfather's grandmother had described in letters I had read once and half believed. The hall was very quiet. Brack looked at our wrists, he looked at me, he looked at Senna. "Well," he said after a moment, "that answers the question of her standing." The moot did not resume for 20 minutes. Protocol required it to be suspended when a bond mark presented at a formal assembly. This was a rule so old that most of the younger delegates had to have it explained to them, but Brack knew it, and the Voreth secretary knew it, and they handled it with the careful efficiency of people managing something they had not expected to be managing today. Senna and I stood in the hallway outside the moot chamber. She was looking at her wrist. I was looking at her. "You didn't plan that," she said. "No. The speech, some of that was planned. I've been thinking about what to say if Brack raised the rootless question. He's raised it in other forms before. You've been paying attention to the Cauldron moot politics." "I've been paying attention to you," I said. She looked up. Her face was doing several things at once in the way it rarely did. She was not a woman whose face announced its feelings without permission, but this had overwhelmed the permission system somewhat. "Aldrich," she said, I know it's a great deal at once." "I was going to say," she said carefully, "that the mark burns on both wrists or it doesn't burn at all. That's what my mother told me when I was young. She said if it burns on both, it's real, and there's no argument to be made against it." She paused. "I've been thinking since September about whether there was a conversation to be had. I hadn't arrived at a conclusion. And now, she said, the conclusion seems to have arrived without me." I looked at her, at Senna, who had tended a wounded wolf in the snow without asking whose it was, who had sent border warden reports and argued about road policy and addressed kings without flinching, and called herself rootless with the flat acceptance of someone who had stopped expecting the word to change. "You have ground," I said. "Whatever else happens, you have the Mossgate posting and that's yours regardless, but I would like, if you're willing, to give you more than that." "More than that is a large category," she said. "You're going to have to be specific." "I'm asking you to be my Luna," I said, formally before both packs. "Not because the mark says so, though it does, but because I have thought about you every day since February, and I am a man who does not think about things idly, and Reth has been making his opinion known since the moment he met you." She was quiet. "Senna," I said, "I am asking." "I know you're asking," she said. "You're very clearly asking." She looked at her wrist again. "Yes," she said, "I'm willing." The formal naming happened that afternoon, in the moot hall before both packs. I had sent a writer back to Voreth in the morning. There were things a formal naming required, and Draveth had apparently been half expecting this particular writer for months, because the reply came back in the early afternoon with everything needed, including my scout's cloak, which was the Voreth naming cloak, the one used when the Luna was named in the field rather than in the hall. Brack convened the assembly again. The Cauldron elder, who had used the word rootless without thinking much about it, now watched from his chair with the expression of a man revising his morning's work. I placed the cloak on Senna's shoulders. The scout's cloak was heavy wool dark green, the clasp a silver wolf head. It was not the elaborate ceremonial cloak that would have been used in the Voreth throne room. It was the field cloak, which meant it was the real one, the one used when the naming mattered enough not to wait for ceremony. Senna stood straight under it. She was neither tall nor striking, which I had thought on the night I first saw her and which remained true. but the cloak settled on her with a completeness that had nothing to do with stature and everything to do with the fact that she had been moving through the world for 20 years as if waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for something to fit. I said her name to the assembly. I said what the mark meant and what the naming meant, and I said that the border road had a healer who had earned her ground by working it, and that the moot was witness to both things. The Vorath wolves in the room, there were a dozen of them, border men mostly, men who had seen the injury reports, men who had received help at the Mossgate crossing in one form or another, acknowledged it in the Vorath way, which was a fist to the chest in silence, and then sound. The Caldron wolves were quieter, but Bract stood up at the end and said that the Caldron pack witnessed the naming, and that the healer of the Mossgate crossing was known to them. Senna received all of this the way she received most things, steadily, taking it in, not performing either gratitude or dignity but simply being dignified, which was different. Reth sat at her feet throughout, and made his opinion known to no one in particular. The months after the moot were not without complication. Naming a Luna at a border assembly was not the same as introducing her to the Vorath court, and the Vorath court had opinions about most things, and opinions about this in particular. There were counselors who felt the process had been irregular. There were border families who felt the question of Caldron blood required more deliberation. There were 2 members of the council who submitted formal written concerns, which was their right. I read the written concerns. I responded to each one in writing, specifically and without impatience, because Senna had told me, when I had been less patient than I should have been in her presence on a cold November evening, that the people raising concerns deserved to be heard, and that a king who dismissed concern without answering it was making more trouble for himself than the concern would have made. "You're not wrong," I said. "I know," she said, "the willow bark is steeping, Reth's joint is stiff again." By winter the council had settled. The Mossgate posting had been formally incorporated into the border administration's records, with the non-political language Senna had required. The Vorath injury logs she had been keeping were now a standard document, shared with both border warden offices. A Caldron healer had written to her asking whether she would consider training a second person for the eastern branch of the Greywood Road. She wrote back yes. I was in the Mossgate house on a morning in early spring, the kind of morning that is not quite warm yet but has given up being cold, when I watched her from the window. She was in the yard with Reth. She had a cup of tea. He was doing the thing he did, which was standing close to her and breathing the morning in the way wolves do when they are claiming something without ceremony. She was looking at the Greywood, which was going green at the edges, the first thin green of a new season. She did not wave when she felt me watching. She just looked up, the way she always did, the same unhurried, reading look, the one that had been aimed at me since a winter night in February when I had come out of the trees and she had held the door open. It occurred to me, watching her, that I had spent 11 years governing a border kingdom and a border road and had not understood, until a healer with no ground to stand on taught me by example, that the road was the point, not the territory on either side of it, not the politics that surrounded it, but the stretch of neutral ground itself, and what you chose to do on it when no one was watching. She had been doing the right thing on that road for 20 years, without recognition, without ground, without anyone placing a cloak on her shoulders. She had tended the wolves that came to her door. She had asked no one's permission. The bridge had turned out to be her all along. Reth settled at her feet. The Greywood morning opened. Somewhere behind me the fire burned low, and the house that was now hers and mine held the warmth the way old stone eventually does slowly, and then all at once, and then you cannot imagine it was ever cold. That was enough.